The girl went to her friend's birthday celebration and disappeared without a trace. This mysterious disappearance became the subject of a long and complicated investigation that lasted for more than 2 decades. Despite the fact that the police uncovered several disturbing facts during their investigation, they could not get any closer to solving the mystery. With each passing year, the trail grew fainter, and the questions more convoluted. 20 years later, when everyone had started losing hope of solving the case, a group of experienced detectives made a bold decision to organize an operation that almost resembled the thrilling scenes we're used to seeing in detective films. Undercover operations, risky steps, and unconventional methods of investigation led to the long-awaited result. However, as is often the case in such stories, the truth emerged unexpectedly and with great force. Michelle Bright was born on June 2, 1981, in the small Australian town of Galgong. This place, home to only about 2,500 people, was far from large cities and had a peaceful, measured atmosphere. There were hardly any strangers in Galgong, and everyone knew each other well. It lacked the hustle and bustle of big cities, and every day seemed to be like the one before. Michelle grew up in this quiet harmony with her parents and 2 older brothers. As a child, she was a cheerful and energetic girl who loved animals. She attended the local school, where she was popular among her peers. During her school years, Michelle was actively involved in basketball, one of her main hobbies. She dreamed of becoming a veterinarian and was convinced that it was her calling. She even had her own horse, with whom she spent a lot of time. From a young age, Michelle also dreamed of having a large family and one day planned to be the mother of 6 children. In 1999, when she was 17 years old, she focused on her studies. She aimed for the highest grades to ensure she could easily apply to the veterinary faculty in the future. This was an important step for her in achieving her dream. On February 26 of the same year, Michelle was planning to attend her friend's birthday. The girls had arranged to meet at her friend's house, and Michelle planned to stay the night at another friend's place since her home was far away, and the journey back would take several hours. That evening, her mother drove her to her friend's house, as Michelle did not have her own car. Before parting ways, she told her mother that she would see her the next morning. They shook hands and said goodbye. But the next morning, when her mother woke up, her daughter was not home. At first, she thought Michelle was just resting at her friend's place, as everything seemed quite normal. However, as each hour passed, her mother became more and more worried. There were no signs of Michelle's presence in the house, and the girl didn't have her mobile phone, which made the search more difficult. By noon, her concern turned into a panic, and the woman started calling Michelle's friends, trying to learn anything about her whereabouts. Every action, every new phone call, only increased her anxiety, and it soon became clear that something very serious had happened to her daughter. Soon after Michelle's mother began searching for her, she managed to find out that her daughter had left the party around 12:30 a.m. in the company of a couple who had agreed to give her a ride to the city center. From there, Michelle was supposed to walk a short distance to her friend's house. However, as it turned out later, she never reached her destination. Concerned about her daughter's absence, Michelle's mother decided to continue the search and contacted Michelle's friends to see if she had stopped anywhere along the way. All of her acquaintances claimed they had not seen the girl that night. Time passed, hours turned into long minutes of waiting, but all attempts to locate Michelle were fruitless. This only heightened the woman's anxiety, and she began to fear that something terrible had happened to her daughter. When her mother had exhausted all possible contacts and could not find a single clue, she decided to go to the local police. However, the police were clearly skeptical about her request. They believed that Michelle was probably just spending time with friends or had left without warning, perhaps even deciding to run away from home. The officers refused to start a search, thinking that the girl would eventually find her way home on her own. Despite all the convincing arguments from her mother, who assured the police that her daughter would never just disappear without a trace, they continued to refuse to launch a search operation. As a result, the woman, with the help of other relatives, began searching for Michelle on her own. They went door to door in the city, questioned the locals, and walked the streets, but their search yielded no results. This continued for several days, until the evening of March 2nd, when a man walking his dog along a road leading out of town noticed something strange. He was walking along an old railway track, and as he passed some tall grass, he saw something unusual. As he got closer, he realized it was a human body. The man immediately reported it to the police. When officers arrived at the scene, they quickly determined that the body was Michelle Bright's. Her clothing was partially missing, and her bra had been torn off. Her backpack was found near her body, but no other evidence was found at the scene. The body was found only a few hundred meters from Michelle's house, but due to the tall grass, it was almost impossible to spot from the road. Experts, upon examining the body, found multiple abrasions, and the cause of death was determined to be strangulation. They also concluded that Michelle had been sexually assaulted, but despite a thorough investigation, no biological material from the perpetrator was found. A few hairs were found in the girl's hand, but it was not possible to extract a DNA sample from them for further analysis. When the police finally established that it was a murder, they began an active investigation. The first step was to question everyone who had attended the party where Michelle had been. Since her death occurred the night she disappeared, investigators assumed that one of the guests could have been involved in the murder or at least knew what had happened. However, all those present claimed the evening had been peaceful, with no arguments or conflicts. They described Michelle as friendly and in good spirits, adding that she had left with the couple who had offered her a ride. The police questioned the couple, and they confirmed that they had dropped Michelle off on the central street of the town. From there, the girl was supposed to walk a short distance to her friend's house. After dropping her off, the couple left, not noticing which direction Michelle had gone. Michelle's friend also confirmed that she never arrived at her house that night. Investigators began to consider whether something might have happened to the girl before she had a chance to reach her destination. However, they also did not rule out the possibility that Michelle had changed her plans and returned home. The investigators doubted that the attack could have occurred right on the street since no locals had heard screams or other unusual sounds. As a result, the police began to consider the possibility that Michelle might have known the perpetrator. Perhaps he had offered her a ride home and then took her to a more remote location, where her body was later found. Michelle's family also insisted that she would never have gotten into a car with a stranger. It was also important to note that the town was small, and there were almost no outsiders. Michelle would surely have recognized any local resident. Over the next few weeks, the police continued to question people, hoping to find witnesses or any clues. They also began to thoroughly investigate potential suspects and requested DNA samples from them. Although the investigation did not yield any genetic material from the killer, this information was not released to the public. Investigators hoped that with advances in analysis technology, they would eventually be able to extract the necessary genetic sample from the victim's belongings. One of the first suspects was Michelle's ex-boyfriend. It was revealed that the girl had broken up with him shortly before her death. According to mutual acquaintances, the ex was upset by the breakup, which immediately raised suspicions among the investigators. However, there was no direct evidence linking him to the murder. The investigators also could not establish whether he had been at the location on the night of Michelle's death, on the street she had walked. Suspicion also fell on a local resident who, according to the police, seemed too upset about the girl's death, despite the fact that they were barely acquainted. However, as with Michelle's ex-boyfriend, no direct link to the murder could be established. Yet, shortly after Michelle's body was found, another strange incident occurred. One of her relatives, who came to the scene, noticed one of her earrings on the ground. This was unusual because the police had already searched the area, and either they had not noticed the gleam of the jewelry, or the killer, having taken the earring with them, had later returned to dispose of the evidence. This unexpected turn of events led to additional questions. Why had the police not noticed the earring, and could Michelle have lost it herself? Investigators re-examined the entire area, hoping to find additional clues that might reveal the crime, but their search yielded no significant results. Over the course of several months of investigation, they compiled a list of 14 suspects, but none were linked to the crime. The lack of a DNA sample from the perpetrator and other key pieces of evidence made solving the case extremely difficult. All of the suspects provided their DNA samples voluntarily, except for one 23-year-old Mark. He refused to provide a sample, which caught the investigators' attention. Over time, it became known that Mark had a bad reputation in the local community. In the 8 months leading up to the murder, he had been stalking one woman and had even broken into her house. He was later accused of attempting to assault another woman in a nearby town. He had followed her down the street, then caught up with her and began touching her. Although there was insufficient evidence to charge him in that case, these incidents gave the investigators further reason to suspect his involvement in Michelle's disappearance. Additionally, investigators learned that Mark had been in the same class as Michelle's older brother. This created another potential connection to the victim's family. When Mark was questioned, He claimed that on the night of the murder, he had been in the city center and returned home around 1:15 a.m. He said that at that time, he had no opportunity to abduct Michelle, take her to a remote location, and kill her. However, a conversation with his wife revealed an interesting twist in the investigation. She stated that she wasn't sure of the exact time of his return and suggested that he could have come home much later than he had claimed. The investigators decided to set up surveillance on Mark's house, and this led to results. During the observation, they discovered that his wife had also started to doubt her husband's honesty and had repeatedly questioned him, suspecting that he might be involved in Michelle's murder. After several conversations, she convinced Mark to provide a DNA sample to put the suspicions to rest. However, just one day before meeting with the police, Mark was involved in a car accident, crashing into a tree. Investigators did not rule out that this might have been a deliberate act to avoid providing a sample, but despite the incident, Mark eventually agreed to give the police the necessary samples a few days later. However, despite his suspicious behavior, investigators still did not have enough evidence to arrest him. The lack of a DNA sample from the perpetrator remained a serious obstacle. Without this key piece of evidence or any other significant proof, the police could not detain Mark. Eventually, the investigation stalled, and no new leads were found. About a year after the murder, Michelle's family decided to leave town and move elsewhere. They were convinced that the perpetrator was someone local, and being among these people had become unbearably difficult for them. In 2000, a large reward of $100,000 was announced for any information that could help solve the case. This attracted several new witnesses, but all the tips led to no real results, only taking the investigation down dead ends. In 2002, investigators traveled to the UK to conduct further analyses for any foreign DNA on Michelle's personal belongings, but this also did not lead to a successful outcome. Over time, the case of the missing and murdered Michelle was reopened several times, but key evidence still eluded investigators. In 2009, after nearly a decade of silence, the reward for information was increased to $500,000, making it the highest reward ever offered in the state. This substantial amount attracted a large number of calls and tips, but unfortunately, they all led to false leads and did not bring the police any closer to solving the crime. 20 years after the tragedy, in 2019, the investigation was renewed with new vigor. Although modern forensic techniques failed to uncover any DNA traces of the perpetrator, detectives focused on the list of suspects. By that time, only 5 names remained on the list. After thoroughly checking each of them, the investigators narrowed the focus down to 2 individuals, who now became the central focus of all efforts. One of the primary suspects in Michelle's murder case was 56-year-old Craig Rumsby, and there were solid reasons for this. Firstly, at the time of the tragedy, he lived only 2 houses away from Michelle, which naturally drew the investigators' attention. Interestingly, just 2 weeks after the murder, Craig suddenly moved to Sydney. This behavior raised additional suspicions among the police. Secondly, Craig had an extensive criminal record. He had been repeatedly charged with various offenses, including harassment of women, public indecency, and other similar crimes. His criminal activity was not limited to these incidents. He was also involved in other illegal dealings, making a living through illicit means. Furthermore, Craig had previously been a suspect in an assault case involving a woman that occurred a year before Michelle's murder. In that instance, the woman had returned home from a party and was waiting for her boyfriend on the porch when she became the victim of an attack. A man, later identified as Craig, approached her, struck her, and attempted to rape her. However, at that moment, the woman's boyfriend drove up to the house, and the attacker was forced to flee. Although the victim reported the assault to the police, she ultimately decided not to press charges. The problem was that her testimony alone would not have been sufficient for a successful prosecution, and the case was unlikely to result in a conviction. As a result, Craig faced no consequences, and his ongoing criminal behavior went unchallenged. For the investigators handling Michelle's case, Craig became one of the prime suspects, but they lacked solid evidence to officially charge him with the murder. Realizing that the case was not progressing without additional evidence, the police decided to take a risky and unconventional step, organizing a large-scale undercover operation. Considering Craig's criminal activities, the investigators decided to create a fictitious group of people who could make contact with him. These individuals introduced themselves as members of a criminal syndicate with serious connections, including people in the police, which was meant to attract Craig's attention. They told him that they were planning to make a lot of money and needed one more person on their team. Interested in lucrative offers, Craig agreed to join the gang. Over the course of several months, the undercover criminals worked to gain his trust. They constantly told him that their group was one big family and that in order to participate in major operations, Craig needed to be absolutely reliable. Through this maneuver, the police tried to create conditions where Craig could not only reveal himself but also make a mistake that would become crucial to the case. During the undercover operation, the group, controlled by the police, committed a series of crimes. However, the exact details of these crimes were not disclosed, leaving room for speculation. Many of these incidents might have been intentionally planned, or perhaps they were small thefts the detectives carried out to ensure they didn't miss the opportunity to solve Michelle's murder. These actions went on for nearly a year, and at one point, the investigators decided to move on to the next step of their strategy. The gang members informed Craig that they had come under the police's radar due to an old murder case, an investigation that could jeopardize their operations. However, they didn't specify which particular case they were referring to. With each new conversation, they claimed that the investigators were getting closer, and Craig started to get nervous. During one such conversation, he himself said, "I hope they won't interrogate me about Michelle Bright's murder." He then added that he had known Michelle since childhood and she was like a sister to him. This conversation turned out to be a turning point for the police. They began to realize that Craig might indeed be connected to the murder, but he needed more pressure to reveal his involvement. After some time, another undercover detective, posing as a corrupt cop working for the gang, met with Craig. He told Craig that an investigator from a small town had picked up his trail in connection to an old murder case, and that the police were getting closer. Craig kept his composure, but the pressure was mounting. Finally, the police decided to take the decisive step. They organized a press conference where they announced that the reward for information leading to the resolution of Michelle's murder had been raised to a record $1 million. This event attracted the attention of all of Australia and, as planned by the investigators, was meant to increase Craig's anxiety. The day after the press conference, Craig left a comment under a post by the police department on social media. He wrote, "It's such a shame that they still haven't caught her killer. Michelle was like a sister to me, I feel for her family." This comment became another significant moment in the investigation, as his emotional reaction could indicate a deeper involvement in this tragedy. The police then arranged for Craig to meet the leader of the gang, someone he had never met before. In fact, this was one of the investigators in disguise as the criminal leader. The boss told Craig that the police were interested in him for several cases, which put their entire criminal operation at risk. He then asked Craig to be honest and confess if he was indeed involved in the murder. In exchange for a confession, he promised to help him deal with the situation. However, Craig continued to insist on his innocence, claiming that he had not killed anyone. His refusal to confess under the pressure from the police only strengthened suspicions, and the investigators were now certain they were on the right track. During a further conversation with Craig, his boss, the undercover police officer, took out a folder containing materials from Michelle's murder investigation. Inside the folder was a photograph of Craig's old car, which turned out to be an important element of the investigation. In 1999, shortly after Craig moved to Sydney, the police had contacted him by phone regarding Michelle's murder, and the next day his car was found burned. The boss told Craig that they had concrete evidence and that an arrest could happen soon. The psychological pressure exerted by the boss and other gang members began to take its toll, and Craig slowly started to confess. He said that on that evening, he arrived in Gulgong, visited a friend, and then went to the city center, where he went into a bar and spoke with its owner. According to him, after that, he left the car in a parking lot and walked, but he couldn't remember anything else as he had drunk quite a bit. Despite the hazy memories, Craig admitted that he did indeed kill Michelle that night. He said he remembered taking her life, but his confession remained vague. Realizing that such a confession wouldn't be enough for legal proceedings, the boss suggested that Craig go with him and the other gang members to the crime scene. There, Craig was supposed to give more detailed testimony. He agreed, and at the crime scene, he began describing how he had led Michelle into the bushes, away from the road, so her body wouldn't be found. Craig clarified that he didn't remember all the details but carefully described how he had removed some of her clothing. Noticing that the clasp on her bra was broken, Craig mentioned this detail, which had not been previously revealed and could only have been known by the killer. This fact became decisive, as it was information only someone who had actually been at the crime scene could have known. Craig also admitted that a year earlier, he had attempted to rape another woman but was scared off by her boyfriend, who approached the victim's house. He described this incident in great detail, which convinced the investigators of the truthfulness of his words. After Craig gave a full confession, the gang drove him to the airport, where, as planned, he was supposed to board a plane and leave the country. However, this time, they were met by real police forces. At the airport, Craig was arrested and placed in jail awaiting trial. Craig's trial began only in 2023. During the trial, he maintained his innocence, and his lawyer tried to challenge the confession, arguing that it had been obtained under duress and that the confession itself was not voluntary. Craig's lawyer argued throughout the trial that his client had initially declared his innocence and that the confession had been made solely under intense pressure from undercover police officers. He claimed that Craig had made a false confession simply because he had been subjected to psychological manipulation and that he had no other option. However, the prosecution insisted that Craig had always had a choice. He could have left the gang and not told anyone about his involvement in the murder. Furthermore, they pointed to several key details that Craig could have only known if he had been directly involved in the crime. For example, he knew exactly how the murder had been carried out and mentioned the broken clasp on Michelle's bra, a detail only the killer could have known. According to the prosecution, Craig encountered Michelle on one of the central streets of the town and possibly offered to give her a ride or walk her home. Since the girl lived nearby and knew him, she might have agreed to this offer. Once they reached the outskirts of the town, Craig likely attacked her, dragged her away from the road, and took her to the railway tracks, where her body was later found. The trial lasted 7 weeks, and ultimately, Craig was found guilty of Michelle's murder, as well as the assault on another woman. This woman also testified during the trial, identifying him once again, and now, she could finally be certain that he would face the justice he deserved. The judge sentenced Craig to 32 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 24 years. This meant that he could be released at the age of 77 or later, if granted early release. For Michelle's family, this trial was a long-awaited moment that brought them some comfort. The relatives of the girl, who had nearly lost all hope for justice, thanked the detectives for their persistent work, which ultimately led to the truth being uncovered. The tragedy had changed their lives forever. 6 years after Michelle's death, her parents divorced, and her mother struggled to find the strength to go on. Michelle's father and brothers continued to blame themselves for what had happened, as they felt it was their duty to protect her. Now, although with heavy hearts, the family could find some solace in knowing that the killer would likely spend the rest of his life behind bars. This was the only consolation they could find in this tragic story. What do you think about this case? Share your thoughts. Take care of yourself and your loved ones. See you in future episodes.